We'd like to give a special thank you to Pure Project for hosting the Society of Barley Engineers. Thank you.
Hi all, thanks. What we are doing tonight is talking about fine-tuning your brew. And I emphasize that because I'm not talking about, as Stam would have liked me to, adding fruit to your beer and things like that. I'm talking more about changing aspects of the character to make things more to your liking. And of course, Rich helped me with this, and he's going to help me a lot more because he's going to be pouring a whole bunch of beers. We spent a lot of time preparing beers for this, and I hope it works for everyone, but let's see where we go. Okay, so how many of you have brewed a beer, you get all done, you've carbonated it, and you go, it's not a bad beer, but I wish it was a little more bitter or a little more malty or, you know, et cetera, et cetera. It has a little touch of tartness to it that I don't like, et cetera. Am I too far forward? Yeah, you? Okay, there we go. Now there's what we need, a cameraman. Okay, so, you know, largely we develop the character of our beers from the outset by developing recipes, making the water we want, et cetera, et cetera. And we can affect the pH, we can add salts to affect character, we can affect the body by mash temperature, adjuncts, this, that, and the other, et cetera, and as well as developing the bitterness. But many of us don't think about adjusting those characteristics of our beer post-fermentation, and many of those things are accessible at some level post-fermentation, okay? So that's really what I want to talk about. So why do we want to adjust our beers post-fermentation? For the reasons I just talked about, but as well as others. We can get our bitterness more precisely what we want. We can get a little more malt character if we want it. We can just get the beer tuned in. We can correct flaws sometimes. We can enhance certain characteristics of the beer that we'd like to have more of or less of. And really important in commercial brewing is getting consistency batch to batch. We don't all brew the same beer all that often, and we don't really get into that, but there are some here that do those types of things. There's all kinds of post-fermentation adjustments. Stan already mentioned fruiting. We all know that you can dry hop after fermentation, and you can get lots of hop character. You can blend, you can add spices, etc. But then you can also change the pH. You can change the concentration of various ions in your beer, which affect its character, and you can back-sweeten. And so those last two things are really, or last three things are really the things we're going to focus on. Okay? It's taking a beer and doing little tweaks to see what you can do with it to get more to the place you want to be. So, you know, there's a lot of potential compounds you can use. There's a lot of ions you can use in the periodic table, but we focus on a small set of them, and they are basically calcium, magnesium, sodium chloride, sulfate, and bicarbonate. Okay, so each of these things affects the character of your beer, and what we're going to do is start out by just doing a pretty heavy-handed adjustment of a beer that happens to just be a commercial beer. We just said, okay, we're just going to take a beer. We really know nothing about it. I'd actually never tasted it before. It's a Society Hazy IPA called Bulbous Flower, which I think is an incredible name. And it was at Trader Joe's when I went by, so I bought it. I also happened to buy the Pupil, which I inadvertently tried to do the same thing to, but it wasn't the one of choice. So what we're going to do here is just look at what happens when you increase the sulfate in that beer and what happens when you increase the chloride. And poor Rich is over here struggling to pour a bunch of cans into different pitchers and get you the 3 beers you're going to taste. One of them is just going to come straight out of the can. That's the initial beer that you buy at the store. And the other has a bunch of sulfate added to it or some chloride. And so we're going to have hopefully a few people running around and doing that. How far off are we, Rich? We're close? Okay, because otherwise I can. Yeah. So hopefully you have 3 glasses or something resembling it. If you don't, we have some plastic glasses, but a limited number, plastic cups. And you should think of one as glass A, glass B, and glass C. And glass A is we're going to do 4 of these. So glass A is going to be your control, i.e. the beer that's not been adjusted at all. And then you're going to look at some adjustments. And in this case, we're talking about gypsum, which is often used to introduce sulfate. It comes along with its counter ion calcium, so you're adding calcium too. And I added 106 parts per million. I adjusted this beer up by 106, or Rich is adjusting it up, by 106 ppm. We have no idea how many ppm are already in there, but there's not a huge amount. It's a hazy, okay? In the other one, you're going to see the addition of calcium chloride, which is a source of chloride. And in that case, we're going to go a little gentler, but we're still going to introduce 96 parts per million. And you're going to end up with a beer that should be a bit hoppier, or at least a bit more bitter. Than the start.
Yeah, Curt. Yeah, there we go. We're going to keep you right there. Perfect.
Could you get
you keep wandering around, Curt.
We're going to have to get a hook. And then you're with the chloride, that introduces more of a maltiness and a fullness to the beer. It increases the mouthfeel. It makes it feel a little bit more mouth-filling. Okay, so those are the 3 beers. I'm looking at Rich, and he's trying to. We're doing this in pitchers, and it's so foamy that he can't get the lids on the pitchers. But we'll get it to you. I'm going to progress on to the next slide because it's about the same topic. So I'm sure that most of you, how many people know about chloride to sulfate ratio? Some are maybe, some are I don't think so. Okay. Well, the chloride-sulfate ratio is really important in hoppy beers and in malty beers because chloride, as I mentioned, is important for enhancing mouthfeel, maltiness, this sense of fullness, and it increases your perception of sweetness. The sulfate accentuates hop bitterness and creates dryness. And the important aspect that is promoted in this whole idea, and is to some extent true, is that what really matters is the ratio of those two. If you have an evenly balanced beer, it's going to be somewhat bitter and somewhat malty, but it depends on how much hop you added in the first place and what you mashed at and this and that. But that's a 1-to-1. That's a one, which is a balanced beer. 50% one, 50% the other. The argument here is it doesn't matter what level we're talking about, how much sulfate and chloride, as long as they're the same number of ppm. if the ratio is 0.5 chloride over sulfate, then the beer is more bitter because the sulfate is higher relative to the chloride, and it should be crisper and drier. And so the other side of that equation is that if you end up with a ratio of 2, i.e. you've got twice as much chloride as you have sulfate, then you're going to have a more malty full beer. So obviously, which would be more emphasized in IPAs and pale ales? Okay, it's going to be the sulfates, and which would be more emphasized in stouts and porters. Not always true, but it's going to be the chlorides. It turns out that also some other things affect how that works out, and those are the absolute amounts of your sulfate and chloride affect how your beer tastes, and the forgot what the other point I was going to make. Oh, the counter ion. Okay, so I'll talk a little bit about that. What are the other ions you're introducing with your chloride and sulfate? Are we oh, we are. Great. We're getting around the room. Leave yourself some tastes of each beer so you can go up and back and see if you see a difference. Do we have a microphone for the young man behind you? Or I cook a lot, so Vista did chloride makes a lot of sense.
Hang on. There you go.
I cook a lot, and the chloride kind of reminds me of like adding MSG to food because it brings out like a full mouthfeel fullness to the flavor of it.
That's a different thing, but also salt brings along with it a lot of chloride too. And salt gives people the sense of things being more full and more sweet. But you also get the sodium influence, and the sodium influence is what we call salty, right? Okay. So I'm going to taste B, and B is the sulfate-rich one, and I think you'll perceive that that is significantly more bitter, and in this case, it's a lot of bitterness, so the bitter is a little harsh. It's not as much bitterness as if you took an IPA and did the same thing, because it would be really harsh, because in hazies, we emphasize the sweetness and the flavor of hops as opposed to the bitterness. Okay? On the other one, it's a little less heavy-handed, but I think you can taste that it's sweeter. Going back and comparing it with the original beer, and its mouthfeel, it feels a little thicker on your tongue, at least to me. Okay? How many people at least sense those things if they don't like, wow, this is just incredible? Okay. So most people do. So we don't know what the ratios are. What we know, right, we're starting with the commercial beer. We're adding the same approximate amount of ppm to each of these. In one case, it's tipping the scale that way. In one case, it's tipping it the other way. But we don't know what the scale looks like because we don't
Curt,
know what the original is.
So just as a refresher, who passed what around so we know what order they were?
I don't know the answer. Susan had C.
Okay.
Okay.
And Lewis had B.
All
right.
And someone had untreated. Okay. So if you want to do this to your beer, and you might say, okay, I made an IPA, and it's got some hop character, but I just wish the bitterness were more bracing. I want to add some gypsum. Okay, let's say. So you start with the concentrated solution of the salt you're interested in. You want that concentration to be something that's manageable in terms of the amount of parts per million it will add to your beer with the devices you have to measure volume. So if you have a pipette, if you have a dropper that might make small drops, generally droppers deliver drops that are 50 to 100 per milliliter, to give you an idea. But you have to know that for every single dropper that you use, so that when you go to scale it up, you don't have to sit there and put 2,000 drops in your keg of beer, okay? You want to know what the volume is. And scales are very useful because approximately 1 milliliter is 1 gram, and you can drop your drops in and then scale it up from there, okay? Okay, so you're going to take 2 samples of beer. I just did all this with the beers you're going to be tasting. So you take your several little cups, you take two or 3 samples of your finished beer. I used about 2 ounces. And then you start with your untreated beer and then adding 1. Oh, good, I can sit down now.
Curt always needs to be penned in.
I'm very well known for this, and I used to teach a lot, and I would be all over the room. So I'm sure the people on Zoom are thanking you, Katie. So you have one or more for salt additions, and you have 1 for your untreated beer, and then you start adding small increments, maybe a drop, maybe 1/10 of a milliliter, depending on what you're working with, maybe working up to a milliliter or working up to 20 drops or whatever, and you taste it each time. Now the problem obviously is when you taste it, you lose volume. So whatever you determine that you need, whatever you think you've determined is the optimal amount, go back and check it on a fresh glass. Don't ever scale up your keg of beer without knowing that you're really adjusting what the volume you're adding is and what the volume you're starting with is, okay? Because you're going to overdose it or underdose it, okay? So you're going to add it in small, you're going to taste frequently, you're going to figure out the desired amount, you're going to try it again, and you're going to come up with the amount you need for your large volume, which is going to be some multiple of 2 ounces. Okay, what do you use to do this? Okay, you need not necessarily all these things, but something resembling all these things. So I have a little digital gram scale with 1/10 of a gram accuracy. You can buy them for cheap on Amazon, and they're amazingly accurate. And they usually give you a little kit of different gram weights for it, and you can sit and stick them on and know whether they're working well. Okay, you're going to need a whole collection of different brewing salts and acids and bases if you want to adjust all those things. But if it's just gypsum and chloride, great. You've got it. Make solutions of those that are workable concentrations. I use things like 5%, 10%. Gypsum's pretty hard because you got to add a lesser amount, or you got to use a slurry because it's not soluble. You need a pH meter. Everyone who's brewing, and especially if you're adjusting beers, you should really have a pH meter.
Hang on.
Yes, the answer is yes.
So if the gypsum makes a slurry, does that mean it's going to make the beer less clear?
So the gypsum does not dissolve at concentrations you need to do a 1 in 100 dilution, but it does dissolve in the beer. And it happens to dissolve really well when it's cold and not so well when it's hot. But it dissolves in the beer as you put it in because it's at the concentration it should be at. Okay? Thanks, that's a good question. You need a measuring vessel. Lots of people would do graduated cylinders. I use this kind of shot glass thing that's got all these graduations on it, and I just measure the amount in a graduated cylinder or a pipette or something and figure out where the exact right spot is, and then I put a piece of tape on it there. That's how my little arrow. But it turned out to be exactly 50 mils when I wanted to put in 50 mils. So you also need, the best thing are pipettes. Now, do I have a, I guess it doesn't matter because the remote people can't see it, but those pipettes that are sitting in that tube are pipettes you would use in a lab. They came from my lab. When I retired, I brought them home. But it's nice if you have what's called a pipetteman or a microliter pipetter. But it's totally unnecessary. I took that home too. They were going to dump everything in my lab down into the trash can, and I went, no.
The finger wheel ones are good for a couple of bucks.
Yeah, and the finger reel ones where you can sort of roll it up and roll it down, the volume, just like with your thumb. And then, of course, you need tasting vessels. We have lots of those. And you need a place where you can sit down and work, and this just shows where I was doing it at the counter in my kitchen. It's the easiest place, right? I bring in all my rack of different salts and stuff, and you don't need all of this, and you don't need all the different salts, because as I said, sometimes you're just looking to see how much gypsum you need to add, right? Okay, so let's just talk quickly about the effects and concentrations of these various ions. Chloride very often is accompanied by calcium. Chloride, of course, develops malt sweetness in body. Calcium helps with clarity. It helps for things to flocculate and fall out of solution. And you've got to watch out because above about 200 parts per million, it gets a little minerally. It has a minerally character to your beer. Sulfate, which accentuates bitterness and hop bitterness and aroma, and also makes the beer feel less dry, or more dry, excuse me, often comes in with calcium, sodium, and I wrote Na minus, but it should be Na plus, and or magnesium. So these things all have other effects. Mostly they are not a positive thing. Sodium is kind of interesting and adds some rounder and fuller character, and hopefully we'll taste some of that in a bit. Magnesium, though, if you get it too high, it starts causing problems and it gets really bitter. Same thing if you're adding magnesium chloride to get your chloride up. Same problem. And then again, I already mentioned calcium. The ranges that are useful because of some of those negative effects and because you're looking for certain ratios without getting too minerally are sort of in these ranges, and we'll talk a little bit more about those later. These tables that I'm showing you are just to emphasize a couple of points. You don't need to really delve into them too heavily. What I wanted to point out here is every ion comes with a counter ion. If you have a charge on you, like chloride and sulfate, you need to have something to neutralize the charge, or else you're not going to form a salt that we can work with. Okay, it's really basically comes down to that. So chloride often comes with calcium. It sometimes comes, I don't have it shown here, but with magnesium, and it comes with sodium, which we all know about sodium chloride, right? If you look at, for instance, on the sulfate side, sulfate with calcium and sulfate with magnesium do a little bit different thing. One of them's a little bit more complex, a little bit sharp, especially if you start veering up into that 30 parts per million range of magnesium, and one is pretty clean. Calcium is really a pretty clean ion, so it's not as much of a concern. On the chloride side, calcium and sodium have a similarly interesting difference in that one of them seems to emphasize roundness and sort of the complexity of malts, that is sodium, but you got to watch out for getting towards salt, towards saltiness. And we've already talked about calcium. So it's adding something to the main effect, which is the effect of chloride and sulfate. I don't want to delve on this, but if this talk can be made available as a slideshow, or I could make these slides available. This is just a really useful thing when you're working with these ions and these salts. You've got calcium chloride, which adds calcium and chloride, and I've shown what the parts per million are of 1 gram per liter and 1 gram per gallon, which is the first line and the second line. And I've shown how much calcium you're getting in parts per million and chloride you're getting in parts per million at those concentrations. And what you'll see is that 1 gram per liter is way too much for most of these things, right? You can't work with them at that level. Practical working concentrations I talked about. Some things I use at 1 to 10. Some things aren't soluble at 1 to 10. Some things aren't soluble until you get down to 0.2%, like gypsum. And what you do is you just shake it up really well before you use it and pipette it in. And it dissolves, as Susan brought up. Okay. So this is a really nice table. So here are my working solutions, and I'm just showing you based on that particular chart that you can then calculate how many parts per million the solution is, and then determine what level you have to dilute it to in order to get what you want. If you want about 100 parts per million, then you better dilute the calcium sulfate by 100, and you better dilute the 10% calcium chloride by 1 in 500. Okay, so that's 1/10 of a mil per 50 mil sample, about a little under 2 ounces. Okay, and that's how you work with these things. I've already mentioned that the ions come with counter ions. The counter ions and the ions are important because some are detrimental and some contribute to your flavor. And I think I will just move on from that. So now we're going to try another beer. This one he doesn't have to mix up. We have growlers full. So there are 3 beers here. These are going to be called 2A, 2B, and 2C, okay? So A is the untreated beer. Let me tell you about the beer. The beer, I'm calling a fest beer. It's not really a fest beer. This is actually a beer that was made along with the San Diego Brew Lab brewing that's coming up soon that Chris was referring to. So it's basically international lagers, and he was selected to do the rye adjunct, and I was selected to do the control, i.e. it's a smash beer, which is just American Pilsner malt and Hallertau, and and in this case, I fermented with 3470, the Weihenstephaner strain. Okay, but in addition, I did a mini mash with I did a mini mash with brain fog again. I'm missing the name of the malt. I'll tell you more about it in a minute. We'll get back to that. So I did a mini mash to increase the maltiness and the character of this. Thank you. And I then made, when I tasted it, I found it to be not quite malty enough, not quite bitter enough, and I thought, okay, what can I do with this? Well, supposedly you can just add bitterness by adding more sulfate and maltiness by adding more chloride, but it's the ratio, right? But I already knew that if you increase the absolute level of both of them, the ratio is only part of the story. So you can get bitterness with adding more sulfate, even if you're balancing it out with chloride. Okay, so I want to say two things about this set of samples you're getting. One is we have gone to a much, much subtler adjustment. You should think about the things I claim I'm adjusting and then see if you think you can taste them. Some of you will taste them, some of you perhaps won't. One of the things I did was to adjust the beer with 46 parts per million of gypsum. This is adding sulfate, right? And I happen to know this beer, how many parts per million I already have. So I have about an even amount of chloride and sulfate. And I have about 50 parts per million of each. So if you add another 50 parts per million, you're going to get about 100 in terms of the level of sulfate. And I did the same thing to both beers, both samples. I'm all right. Yeah, if you want. Thank you. In addition, I tried them with 2 different sources of chloride. And I used a fair amount of chloride, about 100 parts per million, which is bringing it up to 150, 160 parts per million. Okay? But in one case, it's going in with calcium. In one case, it's going in with sodium. Okay? Now we're into the range here of mini boss competitions. Not to say this beer should be in a mini boss, because it's not a wonderful beer. But to say that we're in the splitting hairs level of how we're adjusting the beer. So when you think about it, think about the fact that chloride is going to increase the maltiness. The balance is towards chloride, so it should be more malty than it is bitter, but it should be more bitter than the base beer. Okay? In the case of sodium chloride, I told you sodium introduces sort of this brightness, this more complexity to the malt. It's a little different than the calcium as a counterion. And you have to go up and back between the base beer and see it. Does anyone see it? Does anyone see anything? Any differences?
Hang on.
By saying it's a
I'm sorry.
counter ion, doesn't that mean they negate each other? So then why would you do it then?
So counterion is just the formation of the salt. So that's something I should have said. Thank you. One of the things about these salts that we're working with is they completely come apart when they're in a solution of water or anything aqueous. Okay? So all of the chloride becomes chloride independently in solution. But the salts themselves cannot form unless they have a counterion. Okay? So you have chloride and calcium acting independently. Okay? I'll just give a little bit more. I'm hoping I have at least one of you that notices something about these things.
I don't taste much difference between these three.
This is why Derek is a national judge. He's checking clarity. He's checking...
So I think B tastes a little bit sharper than C.
Okay. Okay.
I don't know.
B is slightly hazier. Interesting. Unless I just swap the glasses. Or C is some you think is slightly hazier. Well, it would be possible that A would be clearer than the other two, would be likely, because of the issue with gypsum that we already heard about. So, anyone noticing differences that they can say anything about? Justin shaking his head. Chris is raising his hand.
Hang on.
And this sodium chloride definitely makes it richer, kind of mouth-watering, and if you lick the roof of your mouth, you're going to kind of get that saltiness. It's definitely beyond the taste threshold of the salt. So, I mean, it's enjoyable until it is making your mouth water and you're tasting salt in your mouth.
So they say that the chloride, that the calcium level that is tasty as minerally is 200, but every individual has a different experience of that. Anyone else have a comment? Okay, the rest of you don't have to believe me. No. Justin tastes it. You taste anything, Derek?
It seems like with C, you pick up a little bit of harshness at the end.
Yeah, I agree with that. I agree with that. I think that's the sodium, I think. A little. Yeah, so the sweetness, I feel like the sweetness really comes out with that one, and it gets a little overwhelming. Yeah, it feels like it's going in the wrong direction. Yeah. Yeah. A's the best. That's the beer I brewed. I thought that C was the most interesting in that it had a little bit more body, which I felt the beer was a little watery, and I like that in a beer like this. I like that little sodium thing, and I don't know really what it is, but it's a very personal thing.
So Curt, I just blended
Andy.
I just blended A with C, and I do like that a little bit better than either of them.
And how about B and C?
I didn't do B because B I thought was flabby. I didn't like B, but I thought it was going in the wrong direction.
Okay.
But A and C just seemed like it was a little too much.
Yeah.
A saltiness to it.
Yeah, that's the harsh little edge to it.
But if you just back to, I think it was going in the right direction, but just maybe a little too much.
So apparently you picked up a difference between them.
Yeah.
Okay, so I can't guarantee you that the rest of this is going to mean a lot to those who didn't taste, but we're talking about a totally different beer, okay? So we're going to talk a little bit about pH. And I'm showing on the left baking soda with sodium bicarbonate, phosphoric and lactic acid, okay? 3 common, 1 alkaline adjustment going more towards higher pHs, and 2 acids, okay, that are commonly used. I'm just showing you a pH meter and reminding you that if you have a pH meter, you need to calibrate it, okay? So those are calibration solutions. Okay. What does pH do to beer character? Okay? So lower pHs. So first of all, let's look over here where it says beer pH range. During fermentation, pHs can range from 4 to 5.2, sometimes even a bit higher, right? And we know that when we're mashing, we work at 5, 5.2, 5.4, et cetera, right? Those are typical. But finished beer is more acidic and ranges generally from 3.8 to 4.5. So 3.8 is typically on the tart side. It's a little thin, tends to taste watery. 3.8 to 4.2 is sort of in the lagery range when you're talking about crisp beers that are bright, okay? 4.2 to 4.5 is a much fuller mouthfeel. It's softer, and it tends to be the kinds of pHs we're interested in when we're talking about malty beers, and especially roasty beers often taste better in this range. And above 4.5, you're at the flabby, dull, susceptible to spoilage range, okay? Not a good place for beer. So above 4.5, you don't want to be there. Less than 3.8, you might want to be there, but you might be working towards having a sour beer, okay? So, let's look at the target pH, but you can also glance at the chloride sulfate ratio. I forgot that I had this slide in there. So IPAs, 4 to 4.3. You know, something crisp, something bright, emphasizes sulfate for the hop. Stout, more like 4.2 to 4.5, higher pH for smooth roast character, because as we know, roast malts can be tart, they can become a little acrid, and that acrid character is partly due to acidity from the roast malt. Pilsners, 4 to 4.2, clean crisp, wheat, etc. Okay, sour beer, 3.2. I'm sure that some of our lambics go well below 3.2, but it's not a great place to be.
When it comes to the source of these salts, like for Epsom salts, I went into my Rite Aid and I went down to the foot solution aisle and I grabbed Epsom salts for my feet. Is it okay to use those Epsom salts in my beer?
It's arguable, but it's nice to go for highly purified salts. When I had a lab, I used to use my highly purified salts. I have used Epsom salt that you're talking about before, but you should probably go for food grade. Food grade is the key. You don't need research grade. You just need food grade.
Well, for those folks that drank my beer earlier, you got Rite Aid foot grade, not food grade. It was not pre-used.
Yeah, you can chip it out of the wallboard. Yeah, gypsum from your wallboard's great. Or if you're tearing down a house, just save the plaster. No, don't do that. Okay, so again, food grade lactic, food grade, look at that. Food grade phosphoric, to raise the pH, baking soda, and calcium carbonate, chalk. Chalk is a pain in the neck, if any of you have used it. And it does adjust the pH higher, but it requires time, and it depends on what the alkalinity is like in your water. So one of the things I have down here at the bottom is pH adjustments are impacted by the alkalinity of your water and the nature of the alkalinity of your water. And it's a topic that if you want to read about, go to John Palmer's water book, and he will tell you all about it. It's a hairy topic. Okay, it's difficult. One thing that significantly affects or reduces the complexity of your pH adjustment is starting with RO water. It doesn't have any alkalinity in it, any hardness. It doesn't have any what they call permanent alkalinity. Okay? So if you start with RO water, if you want to make your own water, that's a great way to go. Okay, pH adjustment. Take a sample of the starting beer. Measure the pH with a digital pH meter, not pH strips. pH strips don't work, give you accurate results in beer. Decide on a target pH or a flavor profile that you're interested in. And if you're, way below or way above that target pH, you want to start adjusting it back towards what you think is your target. And then you want to do it in small increments and taste it along the way, because just because you read that most stouts are better at 4.4. In some cases, it may not be true, okay? And in your particular case, if it isn't true, you're going to adjust your keg of beer, and you're going to be in the wrong area. Retest, and as I said before, if you're sipping and then adding more and trying to taste things, make sure you start with the volume you expect to start with, use the amount you think you need, and then take it from there and scale up, okay? And then you might find, because pH is kind of a wily beast, you might find that your 5-gallon keg is not really exactly at the pH your 50 ml glass was at, and you might start wanting to start playing around again, okay? So these are just, we're not going to drink these. These are just, you see my bottle of flabby weed over here. We're proposing that we're starting with a really flabby beer, pH 4.6, lacks crispness, and may kill us someday if we don't watch out. Target pH should be 4.1 to 4.2. There's a wheat beer, a light wheat beer. It's going to be refreshing, bright, etc. Add lactic acid. And in the case of a wheat beer, lactic acid is kind of a nice thing. It's a nice kind of sourness to have if you're getting towards the tart side. Add about 0.5 to 1 mil per gallon, but do it in increments, okay? And that's how you might deal with this beer. How about a harsh, overly acidic stout? pH 3.7, that is hairy. Really, really sharp. This thing is going to be harsh, okay? And when you mix dark and sour, it doesn't always work. There are some cases where people make dark sour beers, and they're wonderful, but you really have to dial it in. So you want your target maybe to be up at 4.3. Add sodium bicarbonate, okay? About 0.5 gram per gallon. And do it in 0.1 gram increments. Now they're telling you in gallons, but I would say dial back to a 2 to 4 ounce cup and start figuring out what you need, okay? This is just to point out that in some cases salts affect pH. When you're doing adjustments, the degree of saltiness in a solution affects your pH. The ability for you to change the pH or the aggressiveness of that pH adjustment. And so you should always check back and make adjustments afterwards if you've been playing around with your salt concentrations. Okay, so now we're going to do another sample. Rich! I brewed a London Porter. I think the board members tasted it. And it was from a recipe from a friend of mine named Eric Robinson, who won a gold at NHC with it. It's called Big Ben, okay? The difference is that I just wanted to use whatever malts I had laying around, and I happened to have a lot of malts laying around from Bagby. And so I used some brown malt, some DRC, which is a dark roasted caramel malt, and some light chocolate malt. And when I looked up the color and all the properties of these things, it turned out, and it made a recipe, it didn't turn out as I expected. It turned out a lot lighter than I expected, and a lot less malty. And it also had a residual sharpness that if you sat down and drank a 12-ounce glass, it started to really linger on your palate. Okay? So I looked at it and I said it needs to be a higher pH, which it turned out it was 4.1. I know I'm losing a lot of you to pouring. So it started out at 4.1. I decided I wanted to be around 4.3. So I used baking soda. Huh? Yeah. Yeah, this is my beer. So I wanted to use some baking soda. I thought it could be a little more bitter, and I expected it to be based on the IBUs I added. So I thought maybe I'd pump up the sulfate a little bit. So I added some gypsum and I added calcium chloride to increase the sweetness and malt perception. Because as you get perceived sweetness, your dark malts especially seem to really pop more as sweetness develops. So you're just getting two beers, A and B. A is the original beer. B is adjusted in the way shown here. It's got about 50 ppms of calcium sulfate, which is gypsum. It's got about 100 ppms of chloride, so it's chloride heavy. And the chloride was already somewhat, well, I'll get into that in a minute. And I added bicarbonate, sodium bicarbonate, which is baking soda, to 72 ppms. That did result in, I did this all stepwise, I did it all incrementally, and it did in the end adjust the pH to 4.3. Okay, that sort of softened the beer. But then it needed these mineral adjustments, and you can see what it looks like down at the bottom. There's actually a higher chloride level than there is a sulfate level, but it's not a ratio of 2 or anything like that. So that's what you're drinking right now. Okay, do you notice a difference between the two beers? Yes. Okay, good. This is a different beer, and it's got, you know, there's a lot more malt profile to it, so it's got a lot more that can show off, and so you notice the result better. So this is where I got to at this point. There's more. Okay? Let me just make a couple comments about salt adjustments since we're going to move out of that. We're already moving out of that. You don't want to over-adjust. I've already said that because it's hard to undo. If you add too little, it's okay, but it's hard to take it away. Using pH strips is inaccurate for beer. Ignoring the temperature when you're measuring pH is also a problem. Adding salts in the dry form directly to beer is not a great idea. It's easier, it's better, and it works more effectively. You can measure better when you are adding a solution, and it dissolves quickly, and you can see the result quickly. Adjusting without tasting along the way is a mistake, and assuming that all beers benefit from the same adjustments, right? So we've already seen that. You know, an IPA may need sulfate, a malty beer may need more chloride, etc. Okay. Now I want to just talk a little bit about enhancing flavors using sweetness. I already mentioned that when you have a little sweetness, malt character tends to pop more. That's true to an extent until it gets cloying, but I'm just talking about little tweaks to sweetness. You put in a little bit of sweetness. A small amount, sometimes imperceptible as being sweet, okay, can add a lot to a beer in terms of its malt character. It's true for malt, it's true for chocolate especially, it's true for fruit and coffee, sort of mocha flavors, and there are other flavors that are affected. You just sometimes just need a little bit, okay? And I happen to have judged beer in Mexico with the woman who does this thing, Pints on Panels. She has a pretty cool collection of drawings. She's kind of like a cartoony person. I don't necessarily agree with her order of beers here, but that's okay. Okay, what's the sugar you want to use, especially post-fermentation? is lactose. Lactose is not going to re-ferment when you add it because Saccharomyces doesn't ferment lactose. Okay, so it also has an advantage of you have to work pretty hard to make lactose cloying. Okay, it is not a super sweet sugar. You can overdo it, and I'm sure you've seen evidence of that in some of the beers you drink. But it tends not to be cloying. And if you look at this panel here on the left, you'll see that lactose, this is comparing the degree of sweetness of perceived sweetness of sugars. Lactose is the smallest red dot there, okay? It's just not super sweet. As I said, it's unfermentable. You can make small additions that bring out malt character, and you can find it in quite high amounts in milk stouts, pastry stouts, some fruited sours, New England IPAs, which in my opinion don't really need it, but they often have it. Ouch. No problem. Okay. So to work with lactose, you can work with very high concentrations and put in very small amounts, or you can work with more dilute samples. It's easy to add a lot of lactose to your beer because you can make a 50% solution of lactose. Okay. And it's surprisingly forgiving in terms of the nature of its sweetness. Okay, so these are just, some of these numbers are crazy, but they're things people do. Up to 12 ounces per gallon in a milk stout. I mean, this is going to be a super creamy sweet thing, but this is going to be like way out there, okay? But you find these levels. 4 ounces is probably reasonable for a milk stout, but still sounds pretty heavy. New England IPAs up to 8 ounces per gallon. I don't want to drink that, okay? Fruited sours. I've had some of those that, you recoil when you take a sip of them. But if they're a little sweet, they bring out the fruit. It's a super good way of bringing out a little bit of the fruit character without noticing that it's really sweet. Coffee porter mimics creamer, but at 10 ounces per gallon. Yikes. That was just a table I got somewhere. We're going to do a real-world example, and you'll notice that if you look at what we're doing here, we're adjusting this beer. This is the same London Porter that's already been adjusted with all the minerals and the pH. Okay, that's what we're starting with. And we're adding 0.6 mils of a 20% lactose solution, which gives you 3 ounces per gallon. Okay? Excuse me, 0.3, 0.3, below anything on that chart. Okay? And it really, truly, in my mind, you don't really perceive the sweetness as much as you perceive new chocolatiness and things like that. You'll see what you think. This is another A-B tasting, and the last tasting, 4A and 4B. Any questions while we're... Pickling lime. I have never used pickling lime. Has anyone ever used pickling lime? How do you like pickling lime? Seems great. I just never have had any.
Be careful, it's dangerous.
Yeah, it's dangerous. Yeah, it's super basic. It can burn you. It'll take your skin. It'll take your skin off. Yeah.
My question is for A, did you treat it after brewing or before, or while you're brewing?
All of this is post-fermentation. It's the last beer you drank.
Oh, it's the same A as last time.
It's the same B as last time. I took the B and I made it now A for this one.
Because that's not confusing at all.
3B is 4A. Salt adjusted, but now we're adding lactose to that to see if it brings out anything more. You shouldn't have to work on your beer this hard, but I thought it was kind of fun to go through all the different things with it to see if I could get rid of the couple things that were really bugging me about it. The pHs of A and B in the last one, of A in the last one was 4.1, and the pH of B was 4.3. And this A and B are both pH 4.3.
Over here.
Yeah.
So what was the total amount of beer that you brought for this presentation?
That's what I'm saying. I brought 5 gallons of beer. Rich and I blended all these beers except for the New England, the hazy, this afternoon. Does anyone have beer that they're tasting, and are people seeing any effect of this lactose?
I thought you messed it up a little bit on the last one and went a little too sharp, and then the lactose kind of cuts that and brings it back into the sweeter territory, where like I think if I had the whole progression in front of me, this last number B would probably be my favorite.
And the too sharp was more of a gypsum sharpness, harshness?
Yeah, it was just like too much mineralization going on.
Okay.
And got kind of too dry, and then now this little bit of sweetness picks it back up and brings it where I want it.
Great, great. This is actually how I now have about a half a gallon of the beer left, and this is how I'm going to adjust it. You might also notice that you can pick up a little more in aroma when you have a little bit of sweetness, pH is not low, etc. Okay, so hopefully that was informative and enjoyable. I know it was dense, and I know some of you couldn't detect part of it, but it's part of the game. And, you know, if you're judging a lot, you learn to really focus in on characteristics that are characteristic of the beer style and start seeing what needs to happen. And I won't claim to be an expert at that by any means. But I think this, especially when it's something simple, this post-fermentation adjustment really is a worthwhile thing to know about and think about. Like you just get a beer and it just, I need a little more hop pop. I need a little more sweetness to balance it out. I need a little more mouthfeel. There are other ways to go, and there's obviously lots of other post-fermentation. You can use maltodextrins and all kinds of things. But I think this is an area where everyone has access, and you usually have the brewing salts because you're using them to make your water or whatever.
There you go.
Okay, that's better. So I wanted to circle back around the cider that I brought, where I had fermented it with the QA23, which pretty much stripped all the sugar out of the juice. And so I back-sweetened it with honey to try to bring the sugar acid balance back up. But I found that the cider was still a little on the tart, acidic side. I would really kind of like to reduce the acid a little bit. So would sodium bicarbonate be the best to reduce that?
I'm
or
not
calcium carbonate?
I'm not absolutely sure it'd be the best, but it would work. And the other thing is you might try playing around with, well, you have something that's too acidic already, and it's it very well could be malic acid.
I'm sure it is.
Yeah, and I don't know how those two things play together, but it'll certainly neutralize it to some extent. And Justin's behind you, and he's going to tell you all about it.
Yeah.
if you decide to add baking soda to your cider, do it outside.
So, yeah, let me tell you what not to do. So this one time about 15 years ago, I had made a sorghum gluten-free pale ale for someone, and it turned out way too dry and was not very enjoyable. So I decided, okay, I'm going to sweeten it up a little bit with lactose, and I opened up the carbonated keg and dumped a pound of lactose in there, and by the time it hit the ceiling, there was no possibility of getting that lid back on.
Right.
And that carpet was never the same. I just
Everything
had
should
to move
be
out.
in solution if you can do it.
Yeah, make sure you make aqueous solution before you're adding any powdered anything to anything carbonated.
Don't do the thing that was on the introductory slide that
Yeah, Curt already mentioned that, and I can tell you from experience it doesn't go well. It is very hard to clean beer out of popcorn ceilings.
Okay, so I was wondering, have you tried adding amethyst for its healing powers or citrine for its cheerful energy?
I've been very interested in them, but I haven't gotten to them yet.
Curt, great presentation. I loved it, and I just want to also point out that you had mentioned some of the other areas that you weren't covering today, and these are areas that we've covered in the past. Blending and adding fruit and things like that. So if anybody here wants to start looking at some of those other things, they should dig into some of the things that we presented.
Andy's
on in the
fruit
past.
demonstration is, fruit presentation is fantastic. I don't know if anyone's really talked about spices very much. Have you, or if someone else has?
I don't know, not so much. I wanted to sort of echo what Chris Banker was saying about, so I was actually, I actually thought when you made the first pH adjustment to your beer, I thought it softened it. I thought it was going in the right direction. But then I do agree with Chris when you added a little bit of lactose in there, that for me also was the best. The best blend.
I agree personally.
But I also thought that the pH adjustment made an improvement on it, which maybe is a little different. Yep. And the other thing I wanted to point out, since we're kind of looking at some of these, the first tasting that we did where we looked at calcium chloride and calcium sulfate, and I don't know if anybody else got this, but for me the calcium sulfate change was a lot more muted than the calcium chloride. The calcium chloride change was like, boom, it's like you've totally made this thing a different beer. And the calcium sulfate was, maybe you've changed it a little bit.
Part of the reason Andy, is that that beer has 16 IBUs in it. So it's not a lot to work with in terms of bitterness and drying out and all that.
Yeah.
So, I think it matters the beer again. Sometimes like in a hoppy beer, the sulfate is going to have just a massive effect, and the chloride's going to seem, it adds some sweetness to that already bitter beer.
A great presentation, and I think this is a really good way for us to start looking at some of our beers and thinking, well, maybe if we don't like something that we can change it. So
how many people do what you would call a post-fermentation adjustment on their beers, in terms of not in terms of fruit or spice, but in terms of like minerals, pH, this, that, and the other? And how many people do a lot of fruiting and spicing and chocolating and coffeeing and all that, right? So it's more common to find people that are doing flavorings to their beer, which I think is valid, wonderful. I love coffee and beer. I'm a big fan of chocolate and beer. But the others, and blending we do all the time with the sour beers, right? And it's a critical component of making sour beer. So,
so at home I'm using potassium chloride on my food as opposed to sodium chloride. Any thoughts on potassium chloride in beers?
People use potassium chloride in beer, and beer has a lot of potassium in it. Grain has a lot of potassium in it. And I think it's a fairly, it's got a much lower flavor profile than sodium, for instance. Sodium has a very, very distinct, we're very tuned into sodium as human beings. But potassium doesn't, and that's why potassium chloride feels a little flat. And people are frustrated when they've got to cut down on their sodium intake and they've got to use potassium chloride. So yeah, but I think it might be a very good source of chloride. I've never used it. Yeah, you have it there at your house. Make us one.
Okay.
Okay, thank you all very much. I hope you learned something and hope you enjoyed. Thank you to Rich for helping figure out what we needed to present and also making and serving all your beers.